Hello, my name is Michael Martin. As mentioned, I'm the Central New York Regional Advisory Officer for the New York State Archives. And what we're going to talk about today is preserving and promoting your local historical records. Okay, so we all know that archival and historical records are necessary to document local governments and the communities that they serve. Local history provides unique information and stories of people and communities. It also creates a context for regional, state, and national history. Today, I'm going to talk about the local historian's role in identifying and promoting local records, as well as options to preserve and make accessible these local treasures that you're in charge of. Not to mention what we at the State Archives can do to help you. And I'm having trouble. There we go. All right, just a little glitch there. Okay, so first things first, we need to talk about how cool and amazing these local history records really are. Local historical records that you're all responsible for do all of these things. They supplement other sources. They fill in the gaps for regional, state, and historical records and trends. They provide color and depth. They give us the stories, the anecdotes, the narratives that we're looking for. Local history helps bring to light the heroes, the villains, and sometimes people who are a bit of both. They contain unique information. These records have information that simply no one else does, information about people in your community in detail, and they lead to additional resources. They're the first step to state and federal records for you and your researchers as well. Now, when we're talking about these records, we're talking about a whole bunch of challenges. They're going to present a whole bunch of challenges to any historian. Unfortunately, many of these records have been destroyed, whether due to disasters, floods, fires, you name it, or simply improper storage. Many records have been lost over the years. We all know about those gap years. Maybe it's just a few years, maybe it's 10 or 20 years where you simply just don't have anything. There's no central repository. Rarely is a single record placed, rarely are these records rarely is there a single place where these records are stored. These are stored in offices, basements, attics, garages, libraries, historical societies. There's no single place where everything can be found. We're dealing with poor storage facilities. These are poor storage facilities because, unfortunately, most don't see the value of these records. These records shouldn't be stored in basement and attics. They simply are, though, typically. Records are not accessible. Because of where and how these records are stored, they're not easy to get to. And people aren't going to be able to see the value of these records if they can't even see them. You're also dealing with minimal research space. Rarely is there any kind of space for you to work with, let alone somebody else to come in and work with these records for research. And staff is not in the history business. Staff doesn't necessarily know what exactly the importance of these records are. They may know how to organize them. Your clerks may be great at that, but they don't know the larger context of the records. They don't know the larger context of these records in the history of your community. So what exactly are the role of a local historian? Well, it kind of can depend, uh, varying on the nature of one's assignment. A local government historian is going to be a lot different from a historian who's employed by a local historical society in terms of maybe their interest and focus and where their role falls in. No matter what, though, everybody's going to fall under that research and writing, that interpreting the past kind of thing. It is what historians enjoy doing most of all, after all. And then we're talking about teaching and public presentations. So once you have this information, those stories, you want to share it with others, students, the public, make sure that information gets out. Then there's organization and advocacy. Historians need to organize these things, these records, so that they can be found and shared after all. And once they have been found, you want to make sure you're shouting from the rooftops, talking about what you have so that everyone will listen. And of course, we're talking about historic preservation. That's a role of a local historian, making sure that these records are preserved for future generations. I know it's a lot. And we'll talk about each of these as we go on. But before we get too far into it, I want you to remember while you're wearing a number of different hats, there are some things you're simply not expected to do. You're not an archivist. This is where the state archive staff come in. Ask us for advice. We can help you with that. You're not a museum curator. You may not know how to preserve all of these records, how to arrange these items in a display or, for an exhibit. Get some help with that as well. You're not necessarily a genealogist. You may be interested in genealogy, but you may not be a genealogist. And you're not an architect. You can't design a place to store all these really cool records in and of themselves. So you're not expected to do everything. So what are historical records exactly? First things first, as a local historian, you have to identify what records are historical. And how can you do that if you're not even sure what those records are? You have a pretty good idea, but what exactly do you use to determine that? And we'll talk about that. Okay, so sometimes, it's pretty easy. It's old, so it looks important. Other times, not so much. So you have to do something that's called appraisal. And what that is, it's a process of asking certain questions about the records that you have. So sometimes in a retention schedule, and that's, legally tells you how long you need to keep the records, you'll see permanent, but you'll also see something that says, appraise for historical value. Well, when you're appraising them to see if they're important or not, these are the questions that you're going to ask. When were the records created? Were these records created during an important time period in your community's history? Or do they cover a time period that is one of those gaps? Is it a record that covers something that you have nothing else for, maybe for 2 years, 5 years, and so on? If it's covering one of those infamous gaps, you want to make sure you're keeping those records. We have a rule at the state archives. You can't get rid of anything prior to 1911. Why? Because we had a fire in the state library in 1911 that destroyed so many records. We want to make sure that we have a copy of something that you may have, make sure we haven't lost it as well. Why were the records created in the first place? These records document, the functions of the offices. Make sure you know why these records were created. What is in the records themselves? These records are an important source of information because they may be the only source. They may be the best source. Maybe they refute something that is a common held belief, or maybe they help reaffirm it. What is in the records themselves that makes them important? Then who created these records? Was the person who created the records, did they hold an important position in government? Is it the mayor, the county executive, the town council, what have you? Sometimes the person who created the records dictates how important they are. And then finally, why keep these records in the first place? Why exactly do you need to keep them? Well, you figure that out by weighing the answers to some of these questions in an appraisal. And you make decisions based on how important the records are according to these answers. But, appraisal's not the be all end all. There's also some basic definitions that help you determine what exactly is a historical or archival record. It's more than just, your interpretation. There's the historical and, archival record definition. And that's a record with ongoing value. It needs to be kept permanently because it needs to be kept for administrative, legal reasons, physical, or, research value. And then there's a historical archival value, the long-term usefulness for historical research. And we have a really good example of that going on right now, because everything that's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, people are interested in. We know people are going to be interested in the long term as well. So you make sure you're keeping those records of the major policy decisions that are being decided for what you're going to do in terms of, um, masking mandates or vaccines or what have you. People are going to be interested in those in the future and the short term. So we know that you want to keep those records. We know that there's an intrinsic, historical interest in them to begin with. And another big clue is they're listed as permanent on the LGS-1 retention schedule. Really good clue that these are historical or archival records. So there are plenty of examples of historical records that you probably come across all the time. And I'm going to go over a few pretty quickly. Tell me if you recognize some of these, right? Okay, tax records. We all know about tax records, your assessment rolls and everything else. They have some pretty powerful information because, again, in many cases, this is the only record for some people of anything that they were captured. Your personal property records, maybe highway, school taxes, real property, you name it, plenty of examples. Again, sometimes unique. They're going to be unique, and sometimes it's the only way you can capture information on some individuals. Court records, they can be extensive, particularly if you're talking about criminal records. Civil, sometimes you can find some extensive information as well. Probate, we all know about wills and everything else. There's going to be some extensive records there. More examples of historical records. Your real property records. This is your deeds and mortgages, building zoning, and so on. Maps and drawings. Anybody who has a house is interested in what happened before them, about the owners and what's been done to the house in that time period. So you've got a built-in interest right there, right then and there. And most of these have to be kept for an incredibly long period of time, because if they're not permanent, they typically have to be kept for as long as the structure exists and another 6 years or so. If that's true, then that's usually more than 100 years and sometimes even beyond that. So while they may not be permanent, it's pretty close. Our school records. Now, this is where you have student census, your diplomas. When you talk about publications, yes, this is where we're talking about those yearbooks, more photographs, that sort of thing. Again, something that connects everybody. Everybody has to go to school. So probably going to find a record of just about everybody there. And then we have administrative records. Okay, so this is your minutes, your highway and fence, your personnel, the publications that the local government, yourself puts together, photographs. Here's another one, video and audio recordings. Those can be historical too, because people are particularly interested in them. Again, I go back to the COVID-19 example. People suddenly had to do things online, including meetings and everything else. That was all done online. I mean, we've all been through Zoom like now, right? And people have examples of that. Many people are going to be interested in these video and audio recordings from these meetings from this time period of COVID-19, because in many cases, these are some of the first examples, or the first, if not the first, then the first major effort that everybody had to put towards these. So people are going to be interested in these on two different levels. And of course, our vital statistics records. We know that those are important, right? The birth, marriage, death records, burial permits, examples. We know that those need to be kept. We know people are interested in them as well, particularly genealogists. And then there's other local government records that we have examples of. Naturalization and citizenship records. People are always interested in those. And sometimes those are held at the local level. Not always, but sometimes. Any penitentiary, jail records you may have, those personal property records. I already talked about public health, your welfare records, particularly those before 1930 or so, your census records on the federal and state level. Again, you're capturing information for individuals that would have fallen through the cracks any other way. So you have historical records, and what can you do to make sure that they're easier to find? Make sure they're easier for people to find, for you to find. You can organize, arrange, and describe them, and that needs to be done. So first, you need to organize these records. And here's where we can help as the state archives. We can let you know about some key archival principles here. There's provenance. And that's basically, we're making sure that the records aren't getting mixed together. So records of one office should not be mixed with those of another. Basically, keep things separate if they started off separate. Another principle that you want to follow is what's called original order, and that's retaining the original order that was established by the office before they're handed over to you. If there is an order in the records from the original office, make sure you keep it. Don't start ripping things apart and organizing things in ways that you think would be important. You organize it by how it came to you in the first place. So for example, don't organize it by subject unless it already is in that order. Another concept is this idea of record series or group of related records. These are used, filed, and managed together. Now, if you're not exactly sure what record series something may fall under, at least according to our retention schedule, this is when you can contact us because we can help identify those records according to the record series in the retention schedule. So contact your regional advisory officer. If it's not me, you can find out who else it is, and we can definitely help you identify those group of related records. I've had people just kind of scan things, send it to me and say, hey, what's this? And then I tell them, this is exactly what this is. And like many examples, we have a publication to help with this. This is publication 40, and it's basically, fundamentals of managing local government archival records. And you can see that on our website. So those are the basic principles. Now, what about the next step? Now we're talking about the arrangement of the records themselves, how you're putting them together. So arrangement may include some of these activities, but maybe not all. It kind of depends on the records, what kind of condition they're in, and what you're dealing with. First of all, you want to make sure that these records are boxed and folded in archival quality storage material. This means they're buffered and acid-free. This is going to make sure that the folders and boxes themselves will not damage the records. Now, not everything needs archival quality material in your, in all the records, but historical records do, because those need to be kept permanently. Those need to be kept for a very long time. So you want to make sure you have the right boxes, the right kind of folders. If it's possible, you remove those fasteners, you unfold the records, you flatten them out, and you clean them. Now, we're not talking about forcing something that's brittle to flatten out or, unfolding something and it starts to fall apart. Leave that alone. We'll deal with that, as a problem later. We're not talking about trying to get a stain off of something. We're talking about clean. We're just talking about removing some of that dust. You want to label those boxes and folders. You're putting some kind of system of labels and naming conventions on what you're coming across. So you're labeling those record series, and then you're saying it's box one of so many, or it's covering a certain time period. So people know just from a glance what exactly is inside those boxes, instead of just trying to guess for everything. That's definitely no fun. The other thing you're going to do is you're going to integrate this into your designated storage area. So you identify your records, you put them in nice boxes, you label those boxes, and then you put them in your regular storage area, your historical records. Sometimes people separate out historical records. It really depends on how much space you have. So next thing you have to do is you have to describe these records in a way that everyone can understand them. Description has a whole bunch of advantages. It facilitates retrieval and use of the historical records. First and foremost, it makes it easier to find. It gathers that essential information about the records. It identifies the content of the records, the scope, the historical setting, and so on. People have a good idea of what's inside the records because you've described them. right? It helps people determine the usefulness of those records because they know, okay, I know that these are deeds and mortgages from 1859 to 1919. Yep, that's a time period I'm looking for, or nope, not going to help me. I need to find some other box or something else. And then it summarizes the records themselves. So people don't have to, try to figure out what something is. It quickly summarizes it so they can find out whether it's useful or not. Most of all, it's going to save you a lot of time. You don't have to waste time trying to find something that you know should be somewhere, but isn't. You're going to know exactly where it is because it's arranged, organized, and described. Okay, so talked about how to identify things, make it easier to find. What about preserving them? What about making sure that they're going to be around for years and years and years? What can we do? Well, to preserve historical records, there's a couple of things that we should talk about. They need to be stored in a secure, environmentally stable area. I'm going to give you all the specifics on the next slide about the environment, so don't worry about that. They need to be protected from hazards, whether it's making sure that they're not under leaky pipes, making sure that some are in fireproof vaults, whatever it takes. That they're housed in proper archival materials. Again, those are the right boxes and folders to make sure that they're not breaking down, and that they're handled appropriately. This means if you know if something is brittle, if you know something is starting to fall apart, you don't have a whole bunch of people handling it at once. You make sure that people are handling it with the reverence and concern that it needs. One thing you can look towards is reformatting for preservation. What this means is simply scanning something so you can keep the original safe, safe from wear and tear. Let the researchers have at it with the scanned copies because it still has the same information, but you can keep the original safe. All right, finally, here are those environmental conditions, the ideal ones that you want for preserving your paper records. We're talking about a temperature of 65 to 72 degrees, humidity 35 to 45 relative humidity. And we want to keep those fluctuations as little as possible. So only 2 degrees for temperature and 5 degrees for relative humidity. Because when you have those massive fluctuations, what it's doing is it's expanding and contracting that paper. It's like it's pulling it every single day, every single second, back and forth, back and forth. And yep, it's gonna break down when that happens. So you wanna keep those fluctuations down. Now, one way to do that is have a really big HVAC system, humidity, ventilation, air conditioning. But if you can't afford that, you wanna have some basic ways to make sure that you're keeping the humidity and the airflow, you're keeping the airflow so you don't have incredibly high humidity, because high humidity means that you're going to get mold on your records, and you want to avoid that at all costs because that's some serious damage. In a pinch, you can just use a dehumidifier and a fan to get that air flowing to make sure that you are keeping that relative humidity low. And then, you want to look into some kind of environmental monitoring system, but that's not as fancy as you think. It doesn't have to be, hygrothermograph and charts and graphs and everything else. No, you simply can have a temperature gauge and relative humidity gauge. And you can get a little digital one, probably 20 bucks in most cases. Now, is it the best? No, but it allows you to see, okay, I can see the temperatures going up. I can see the relative humidity is going up or down on a daily basis. Make sure you're checking those. Make sure you're checking those on a daily basis, and then you'll see where the problems occur. We can help avoid those, right? Okay, so what about these archival storage areas? Now, there's things that you want to have, some equipment. Once you have a great environment, you need some other things, right? You need steel shelving. We're talking about 18 gauge or lower for steel. And wood doesn't cut it. It can't take the weight, and it will off gas, meaning that it's going to let off some gas that can help the records deteriorate. And again, archival quality storage boxes and folders, can't stress that enough. You want to have a place that has no air pollutants, off gassing. You're not bringing in food and drinks. Keep it clean. After all, the less dust we're talking about, the better. dust, food, drinks, all of that's going to bring pests, and that's what we want to avoid because they're going to damage your records. You want to look into sealing any windows to protect against sunlight, your UV rays, that sort of thing. It's also going to protect against fluctuation of temperature and humidity that we talked about. It's going to avoid that and to help allay some security concerns as well. All right, one thing you have to do is you have to look at your records to see which needs preservation, and those are those simple things you can do to keep them in good shape, and which need conservation. That usually means having a professional who can come in and deal with fixing damaged records. So preservation measures include things like addressing the collection of records as a whole. So you're not dealing with just a single thing, you're dealing with everything. These are preventative measures. You know, it prevents the deterioration or halt the progress of any kind of damage. You can do this by simply having things in the right environment that we talked about. It's much more cost effective than repairing damage. Making sure it doesn't happen in the first place is always much more cost effective. You know, conservatives know their business. They know exactly what they're doing. They're well skilled and trained, but they are expensive. Now, conservation treatment, that's something different. That addresses existing damage, something specific. And it usually is some kind of process, some kind of activity that's used to repair, strengthen, and stabilize the paper records themselves. And that has to be done by a skilled specialist. You can't do that, you know, unless you've gone through that training. So you're hiring a conservator to make sure to fix the rips that are in the documents. Make sure that they're not, you know, if they're brittle and falling apart, make sure that they've been stabilized. Take out that stain from where mold has grown, something like that. Help beat that mold growth. Now, of course, like many things, we have a publication for that. Publication number 60 talks about criteria you can have for selecting records for conservation treatment and when it's an appropriate option. And of course, if you're not sure, you can always ask your RAO. Pretty much any question you have, you can always ask your RAO. So what about promoting your records? You know, I know the description of this topic blabbed about that. We're going to talk about that as well. We're going to kind of wrap up things with that. Okay, so historical records are really great tools for promotion and outreach. You can use them to, you know, build constituency support. People see that you're doing a good job keeping these records. People see that you're doing a good job keeping their history. It's going to bring local government closer to citizens. People feel that connection when they see their family name in something, when they see their great-great-grandfather, aunt, what have you. It pulls people together in terms of the records feeling closer to the area. It's also going to connect you to the world and kind of put you on the map, particularly depending on what kind of records you have and kind of stories that you're telling. Believe it or not, it can spur economic development. Really, I mean, how do you think all those historical trails come about? Whether, you know, it's for the Underground Railroad, the Erie Canal, Central Leatherstocking, all of that. Somebody did the research in the first place, and they had to have started with local government records right then and there, just like you have. So building support for your historical records. Once people know about them, how can you ensure support for these records? Advocacy is all about telling the stories of the people of your community, you know, telling stories, telling the sizzle. You know what people like. They like seeing old photographs. They like seeing handwritten documents. They like hearing the stories of the people who were there before. You can use those research and writing skills you have to put together things like public programs, exhibits, articles. You can use Archives Month. You know, that's in October. You can use Archives Month as a jumping off point to put together exhibits, to put together programs, tours, so on. You can make sure you're promoting your activities online. You know, social media is there for a reason. Social media can help people know what you're doing. If you're putting together a tour, if you're putting together a program or an exhibit, whether it's online or not, you can let people know about it. Promote those activities that you're doing as much as possible. And then if you're doing all of that, perhaps people will, whether it's the board, the council, the mayor, maybe they'll finally see how important the historical records are. And when they see it, when it's important and how it can help them, then they'll actually give you a real budget for the historical records program as well, not just be an afterthought. And of course, we have a publication for that too, publication number 81. It's on historical records and a local government historian. It's really how you can use your knowledge and interest to encourage and support records management and the programs overall. So it's really, really good for advocacy. And if you're stumped, you don't know where to start, here's a really, here are some basic ideas to get you going. Start with your community history. Start with military service in the community. People are always interested, what happened during the Civil War here? Who fought? What happened in World War II in the home front? You name it, people are interested. You can focus on farms, major farms and businesses in the area, cemeteries. You can set up, tours or, a basic history for your cemetery. Of course, family histories, your major families in the area. People are always interested in that, particularly if they're, still part of the community. Schools, always different things going on with schools. Make sure you can tap into that as well. And finally, all of them deal with anniversaries, right? Doesn't matter if it's the 25th, the 5th, or the 200th, there's some kind of major event that's always going on in your community that's being commemorated. It's really an excellent jumping off point to writing about the changes that have been brought about since this major event, or, what kind of changes have happened. And that's a great place to start if you don't know where. Okay. You can also use teaching and public presentations as a chance to share your knowledge of the local history. So you can write something, put it online, and you can also present something. You can teach classes, you can speak to community groups, you can speak to the Rotary clubs, you can speak to the, groups of clerks, what have you. You can create exhibits, whether they're, in glass cases or online, they're going to get that information across. And, if you're feeling bold, you can help develop a curriculum for students in 4th, 7th grade, and so on. You can work with teachers, or we have people who can provide some suggestions as well. We even have some templates online to help with that too. So we have the information, happy to share it. And then most of all, make sure when it comes to your historical records, you're willing to do the work. You're willing to organize, direct, and promote for the records themselves. Direct people, organize people as you need to for these promotions. So this means going to those commemorations of historical places and events, making yourself known, setting up those tours, setting up exhibits, working with volunteers, doing things like networking. Yep, that means just what you're doing right here, all coming together. Make sure you're talking to people because you're probably dealing with a lot of the same problems. Maybe they can provide you with some solutions. There's also, lobbying, making sure that the powers that be know what you're doing and how important it is. And then there's fundraising. Hey, you have to work. You may have to reach out to those big businesses in your community and help fundraising as well. Then there's also grant writing. And when we talk about grants, this is another place where the state archives can help out. Okay, so New York State Archives gives out what's called the Local Government Records Management Improvement Grants. And they're all for a bunch of different categories for records management. One is historical records. So here we have an example right here. Now, need you to understand that this is a competitive grant program. You're competing against everyone else in the state. So make your best case. Explain what records you're working with and explain why they need help and why they're important. We can help fund things like conservation. We can, set up an online exhibit. We can help with an inventory if you just don't even know where to start. We can help with that. Just make sure you describe your records well and why they are important and how they're different and why your problem is different from other people. Now, if you do that, we do have individual grants for local governments up to $75,000. So that's a pretty good amount. You can get a lot of work done for $75,000. What you have to do is you have to go to different vendors, see how much their work their costs, make sure you have correct quotes and everything else. We can work with that. But here's the secret. There are also shared services grants. So if you're working with more than one government, you will have up to $150,000. And these are considered priority for funding. You're going to get, extra priority as opposed to those individual grants. So if you work with another government, you have a better chance of getting a grant and can get a larger amount. So if you have a town, maybe the town and village can work together. Maybe a couple of towns and villages, maybe the county and the town, somebody can work together, you increase your chances of getting a grant. Again, talk to your RAO for more information about this. And of course, we have a ton of free resources. First and foremost, contact your RAO first for any advice. But on our website, we have publications. There, we have publications on a number of different topics, like digitizing your historical photographs, appraisal, inventories, you name it. We also have training like we're giving right now. We also have recorded training in YouTube as well. And then there's also the State Historical Records Advisory Board. They have something called Strengthening the Archives, and that's basically an online tutorial that helps set up a needs assessment. And so you can determine what you need to help make your archives and your historical records better. So administration, processing, preservation, the whole 9 yards, from soup to nuts, kind of covers it right there. And then there's also DIPSNY, or Documentary Heritage Program. They provide education as well for live training, recorded webinars, advice, just like the regional advisory officers. So we're all happy to help you. So that's what we have to help you. Hope that really gives you a good start. You can always reach someone at New York State Archives with the following info: the rec management email and the general phone number there. If you happen to know your RAO's number, you can contact them as well. If you go to our website, there's a list of those as well. So now is your chance to ask your questions. I know a lot was kind of thrown at you at once, and I am happy to help.